Nature can turn a carefully planned hunt into a battle for survival in an instant. From a legendary weapon giving a grizzly bear hell across a snow-laden Alaskan ridge to a hunter's unexpected meeting with a huge wild boar, in this video, you'll witness 6 terrifying encounters that show the raw power, unpredictability, and danger of facing the wild at its most extreme. On February 26, 2025, Eli Navarro moved steadily across a steep Alaskan ridge, following the heavy tracks of a massive grizzly that had been roaming the high country since early winter, and he felt the familiar mix of respect and determination settling over him as he advanced through the deep snow that clung to his legs with every difficult step. He carried his prized .500 Nitro Express, a rifle built for stopping the world's largest game, and although he had no intention of firing at the bear outside the legal spring season, he was determined to understand its movements and push it away from the low valley where winter travelers still pass through. Eli had hunted for most of his life, shaped by long seasons in harsh weather and miles of lonely country that demanded patience, endurance, and absolute focus, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility whenever he tracked predators near human trails. He wanted to see where the huge bear was feeding, where it was denning, and how close it had been moving to the cabins scattered through the lower timber, because a restless grizzly in late winter could create dangerous encounters for anyone crossing its path. The cold air pressed hard against his face, carrying the faint musk of the bear somewhere ahead and the sharp scent of spruce rising from the frozen slope. The ridge climbed steeply toward a narrow saddle. The snow layered unevenly after weeks of shifting winds, and Eli moved with deliberate care because he knew that late winter slopes often hid unstable sheets that could collapse without warning. Still, the tracks were fresh, the wind was calm, and he believed he could reach the upper ridge before the light shifted. He was halfway across a narrow section when a sudden echo cracked through the silence, a sharp, hollow sound that rolled down the mountain like a warning, and Eli froze as the slope above him shuddered. A patch of snow broke free from the ridge, carrying chunks of ice and loose stones in a quick, chaotic slide that rushed toward him with startling speed. He tried to sidestep, but the debris struck his legs, knocking him off balance and dragging him downhill several feet until he dug his boots into the snow and forced himself to stop. When the movement settled, he pushed himself upright, breath sharp in the cold air, and he immediately understood what the noise would have done to the bear ahead of him. Grizzlies reacted violently to sudden shifts in their environment, especially in late winter when food was scarce and instincts ran high. Before Eli could fully regain his footing, he saw the huge creature burst from the broken timber above him, charging downhill with a force that shook loose powder from the trees on both sides of the slope. The bear's size was overwhelming as it descended, shoulders rolling, claws tearing deep troughs into the snow, and Eli lifted the .500 Nitro Express with hands that trembled more from the shifting slope than from fear. The angle was terrible, the ground unstable, and he knew that a rushed frontal shot might only wound the bear and turn the charge into something even more catastrophic. He needed a moment of disruption, a brief hesitation to shift his stance and gain firmer footing. He turned slightly and aimed at a thick spruce trunk 15 yards to the right, choosing distraction over a risky shot at the moving animal. The rifle cracked with a violent recoil, the bullet smashing into the tree and blasting bark into the air, and the bear veered for a moment, thrown off by the sudden explosion of sound and splintering wood. But the charge did not stop. Instead, the massive creature circled, testing him, snorting clouds of frost as it churned through the snow with unpredictable speed. Eli staggered sideways in search of better ground and spotted a half-exposed boulder jutting from the slope, its surface rough and solid beneath a thin layer of snow. He dropped behind it, breathing hard, gripping the rifle tightly as the bear lunged again, tearing into the snowbank near the rock and slamming its weight against the drift in an attempt to reach him. The vibrations from each strike shook the earth beneath him, and the cold air filled with the harsh sound of the bear's breath as it fought to close the distance. Snow and ice cascaded down from the boulder's side as the grizzly hammered at the drift, and Eli steadied the rifle again, waiting for the brief moment when the bear's flank might angle into view. The creature continued its assault with furious strength, driven by confusion and territorial instinct. For several long seconds, Eli could do nothing but brace himself as the massive body pressed closer, sending tremors through the ground. But the slope worked against the bear, forcing it to shift its weight again and again to maintain footing, and eventually frustration replaced rage. The animal exhaled sharply, backed away from the boulder, circled once through the deep snow, and then turned downhill, disappearing into the timber with long, powerful strides that scattered white arcs behind its retreating form. Eli stayed crouched for several moments, heart pounding hard enough to echo inside his helmet, and he felt the sting of scraped skin beneath his gloves and the throbbing ache in his shoulders from the avalanche's impact. When he finally rose, his legs shook from both adrenaline and exhaustion, and the cold seeped through his layered clothing now that the frantic rush of fear had begun to fade. He stood alone on the slope in the fading winter light, surrounded by broken snow and the massive tracks of a creature that ruled this harsh landscape with effortless strength, and he understood once more that only part of survival came from firepower or experience. The rest came from reacting instantly when the mountain shifted, when the ground gave way, and when a giant predator turned its full attention on him without warning. He began the long descent toward the valley, moving slowly through the deep snow that still shifted under his boots, knowing that the ridge had reminded him of something he could never afford to forget. The wilderness demanded respect, caution, and absolute readiness every second he walked through it. On January 14, 2023, Lars Mikkelsen moved slowly across a frozen plateau in western Greenland, the kind of endless white expanse that swallowed distance and sound until the entire world felt like a single sheet of ice stretching to every horizon. He was scouting for caribou tracks during the harsh midwinter period, studying wind-scoured ridges and shallow drifts where the animals sometimes passed in small, hardy groups, and he felt the familiar combination of purpose and solitude that always settled over him whenever he hunted in these remote northern lands. The temperature hovered around -30, cold enough that even his steady breath froze in the air the moment it left his mask. But he had grown accustomed to this environment through years of disciplined preparation and long treks across unforgiving terrain. Lars carried a .308 rifle suitable for caribou, but earlier that morning the sling had snapped in the brittle cold, leaving him to carry the weapon in his hands as he crossed the plateau, and although he tried to avoid unnecessary movement, the weight became more noticeable as each hour passed. Even so, he pressed on because he respected the short midwinter daylight and understood that good tracking required constant momentum, and he believed he could reach a small rise before the wind strengthened again. He paused briefly to study the snow for fresh signs of caribou migration, but the plateau offered nothing except scattered prints far too old to follow. He continued forward, boots crunching through ice crystals that shifted under his weight, and he scanned the ridges out of instinct rather than expectation, because musk oxen sometimes wandered these areas even in the deepest winter. Although the animals were usually peaceful unless provoked, he knew that lone bulls could behave unpredictably, especially when startled in strong winds that distorted sound and movement. He adjusted his pace and continued uphill, tightening his scarf against a sudden gust that cut across the plateau with surprising force. Halfway toward the ridge, a shape appeared against the dull gray sky, massive, dark, and unmistakably alive, and Lars froze as he recognized the form of a solitary musk ox bull standing broad-chested against the wind. Steam rose from its nostrils in thick plumes torn apart by the violent gusts rushing across the plateau, and its heavy coat rippled in the frigid air as it squared itself toward him. Lars expected it to turn because musk oxen usually avoided unnecessary confrontations, especially when winter sapped their energy. But the bull remained still, staring down the slope with a rigid, tense posture that made the hunter's heartbeat shift into a faster rhythm. Before Lars could reconsider his angle or retreat toward lower ground, the giant animal lowered its massive head, horns catching the pale light, and began an unexpected charge that tore through the snow with startling speed. The sound of the hooves thundered across the ice, echoing strangely through the plateau, and Lars reacted instantly, breaking into a run toward the nearest cover, a jagged boulder half buried in wind-carved drifts. The bull gained distance rapidly, its hooves slipping on patches of slick ice and scattering frost into the air with each heavy stride, and Lars felt the vibrations of its charge through the frozen ground. He reached the boulder just in time, dropping behind it as the muskox skidded across the ice where he had stood seconds earlier, the animal's hooves scraping violently while its massive body twisted sideways in an attempt to regain balance. A spray of ice shards burst outward from beneath the bull, pelting Lars's gloves and sleeves as he pressed himself low behind the rock, trying to minimize movement while gripping the rifle tightly. He knew he had no steady position to fire, and he also knew that a poorly placed shot could leave him in far greater danger, so he held still and forced his breathing to slow. The bull staggered, recovered, then began to circle with slow, deliberate steps, its dark eyes scanning the plateau for the shape it had lost during the slide. Confusion radiated through its posture as the wind howled around it, carrying stray echoes that masked Lars's true position and distorted the animal's sense of distance. It stomped the snow repeatedly, sending small clouds of frost into the air, and each stomp vibrated through the ground and into Lars's knees as he remained crouched behind the boulder. The muskox drifted closer again, breathing heavily, steam rolling from its mouth in thick bursts that fogged the air for brief moments before being torn apart by the cold. Lars felt his pulse hammering as the huge animal paused only a few strides from his hiding place, its head tilting slightly, as if trying to catch a scent or shape through the swirling gusts. He understood that any sudden movement could reignite the charge, and he remained motionless, letting the cold settle deeper into his hands and shoulders while the minutes stretched with suffocating tension. A stronger gust swept across the ridge, rattling loose snow from the higher ground and pushing it in a blinding stream between Lars and the muskox, and the animal responded with a low, resonant grunt that echoed strangely across the plateau. The bull stomped again, agitated by the shifting wind and its inability to locate the threat it believed still stood somewhere nearby, and the sound rumbled through the air with a weight that made Lars's stomach tighten. Then, without further warning, the muskox turned sharply away from the boulder and accelerated across the plateau, disappearing into the rising curtain of snow with heavy rhythmic strides that faded into the wind. Lars remained behind the boulder until the last tremor of its movement vanished, and only then did he let his muscles release their painful tension. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging in front of him in a long, unbroken cloud, and he felt the surge of realization that even here, far from traditional predators, the Arctic could produce moments of raw aggression that tested every skill and instinct he possessed. When he finally stood, he adjusted his grip on the rifle and scanned the plateau once more, feeling the weight of the narrow escape settle into his bones. The wind grew stronger as he began moving back toward lower ground, and he knew the long day was far from over, but he also knew he would carry this encounter with him for many winters to come, because it had reminded him that even the so-called gentle giants of the ice could unleash power that threatened anything in their path. On October 9, 2020, Ranger Igor Bichkov moved along a narrow logging road deep in Russia's Ussuri Krai, a region known for its thick fog, dense cedar forest, and the uneasy coexistence of hunters, rangers, and the enormous Ussuri grizzly that ruled the wilderness with quiet dominance. The early morning light barely filtered through the mist, leaving the world washed in a pale gray glow as Igor followed the muddy track toward a small camp where hunters often stopped before moving deeper into the reserve. He had expected a silent and uneventful patrol, but as he rounded a bend, an unexpected shape broke the monotony of the road ahead. A truck sat sideways across the mud, its position wrong in a way that instantly tightened the muscles across Igor's back. He slowed, scanning the surrounding timber before approaching, because nothing in this forest ever happened without a reason. As he came closer, the damage became impossible to ignore. The driver's side door had been bent outward as if soft metal instead of steel, peeled open like torn foil, and deep dents ran across the lower panel where something powerful had struck it with deliberate force. Igor stopped several meters away, listening to the muted groans of the forest around him. The fog was thick, muffling sound to the point that even his own breathing felt distant, and he sensed immediately that something violent had occurred here, something that had unfolded in a matter of seconds, yet left scars across both metal and earth. He approached the cab carefully, boots sinking into the mud, and when he looked inside, he saw the motionless form of Sergei Antonov, a seasoned hunter who often traveled these roads alone during autumn bear season. Sergei lay slumped against the far seat, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, and the interior of the cab told a grim story even before Igor reached him. Shattered glass coated the seats and floorboards like frost. Torn maps lay scattered across the console. A crushed packet of dried fish was pressed into the mud near the pedals, and the strong, unmistakable scent of trampled earth and musk still lingered inside the truck. Most striking of all were the claw marks, deep, violent, and impossibly wide, raked across the dashboard, steering column, and even the ceiling, as though something had forced its way inside with overwhelming strength. Igor felt his breath catch as he examined the damage, because claw marks of that size belonged to only one creature in this region. A creature that had been reported repeatedly over the past month by trappers and loggers who swore they had seen an unusually large grizzly moving along the ridgelines. Sergei had spoken of wanting to track it, not to kill it, but to observe its behavior and determine whether it had begun approaching human sites too boldly. The hunter had always shown deep respect toward the animals, but even experienced men could misjudge the instincts of a powerful boar when fog blurred distance and sound. Drawing from the signs inside the truck, Igor began forming a grim but plausible sequence of events. Sergei had likely parked along the road to watch a nearby game trail that cut through a pocket of alder thicket, a place where deer, boar, and occasionally bears crossed at dawn. He might have used the truck as cover while studying the tracks through binoculars, waiting for movement along the soft soil where fresh prints often appeared before sunrise. The packet of dried fish suggested he had been preparing breakfast inside the cab, trusting the metal frame to shield him from the cold morning wind. But the Ussuri grizzly that roamed these hills possessed both immense strength and exceptional intelligence, and a food scent drifting through fog could draw it silently from extraordinary distances. The ground near the door held faint impressions of a single set of tracks, wide and deep, and the disturbed mud suggested a direct and forceful approach, rather than cautious circling. Igor could almost visualize the bear emerging from the fog, drawn by smell and perhaps by the faint sound of Sergei shifting inside the truck. The dents in the door showed where the bear had struck first, a heavy, decisive blow that bent the metal inward, and the peeled edge revealed the second impact, where it had hooked claws beneath the panel and wrenched it outward with astonishing force. Once the door gave way, the animal had forced its head and shoulders inside, driven not by rage but by instinct and the powerful lure of food. In the tight, confined space of the cab, Sergei would have had no chance to reposition himself, and either the first strike or the crushing intrusion of the bear's weight must have left him unable to defend against the assault that followed. The claw marks across the dashboard and ceiling revealed the frantic motion inside the truck as the animal searched for the source of the scent, tearing at anything within reach. The shattered glass suggested the bear had struck upward or sideways in confusion as it tried to back out, and the disturbed interior showed how chaotic those final moments must have been. When the bear finally withdrew, it had left behind deep gouges, shattered materials, and a devastating silence that lingered even now. Igor stepped back from the truck, turning slowly to study the forest surrounding the road. The trees towered above him, their trunks fading into the heavy fog, and every shadow felt thicker and heavier than usual, as though the forest itself withheld the final pieces of the story. He listened carefully for movement, for the low rumble of a displaced branch or the faint crunch of soil beneath enormous paws, because he knew the bear had not left the region. A predator of that size and confidence would not wander far after such an encounter, especially in early autumn when food sources remained scattered and instinct drove it to seize every opportunity. A chill unrelated to the cold ran through him as he scanned the tree line, knowing that somewhere beyond his line of sight, the enormous grizzly moved with quiet authority, unchallenged and unafraid. The fog thickened again, curling through the cedar trunks and rolling across the road as if swallowing the last traces of the struggle, and Igor realized how easily a moment of routine, an early patrol, a simple stop along a logging road, could shift into something irreversible when the wilderness chose its time. He backed away from the truck, radio trembling slightly in his hand, and the forest behind him remained silent, unbroken, and watchful, as though the predator still observed him from somewhere within its depths. On November 3, 2024, Jonas Kramer moved through a dim stretch of the Black Forest where the trees grew close enough to filter the morning light into long, pale ribbons that barely touched the forest floor, and he felt the familiar tension that always settled over him during late autumn boar season. He carried years of experience on these slopes, yet this particular animal had tested him for hours, slipping through thickets and vanishing into brush so dense that even sound seemed to disappear inside it. The forest smelled of wet leaves and cold soil, and Jonas followed the fresh hoof prints with the steady, cautious rhythm of someone who respected the unpredictable power of a mature boar. The trail cut through an area shaped by old wartime remnants, rusted metal fragments, half-buried concrete slabs, and long-forgotten ditches softened by decades of moss. Jonas moved carefully across the uneven ground, boots sinking slightly into patches of damp earth, and he kept his rifle raised but safe, knowing that wild boars in these valleys could reach impressive sizes and sometimes reacted with explosive aggression when surprised or cornered. The tracks in front of him were wide and deep, spaced far apart in a way that suggested a strong, restless male moving with deliberate speed. The forest grew quieter as he reached a narrow clearing, and the tracks suddenly veered toward a shadowed depression in the earth. Jonas hesitated, studying the darker patch beneath a cluster of spruce branches, and as he stepped closer, he saw the moss-covered rim of an old drainage tunnel dating back to the Second World War. The entrance was partially concealed by hanging roots and fallen leaves, and moist air drifted from within, carrying the unmistakable musky scent of boar that made his shoulders stiffen. He realized the animal had been using the structure as a refuge, slipping underground whenever it sensed pursuit. He crouched to examine the disturbed soil near the opening, noting fresh impressions where the animal had shifted its weight before entering, and he considered turning back because boars inside confined spaces behaved with unpredictable violence. Yet before he could decide his next move, a sharp scraping sound echoed from within the tunnel. It was the rapid, uneven rhythm of hooves striking concrete, the kind of sound that stripped away hesitation and replaced it with immediate instinct. Jonas stepped backward, raising the rifle while maintaining his footing on the slick leaves. The sound grew louder in an instant, filling the tunnel with an accelerating cadence that reverberated through the hollow chamber, and then the boar erupted from the darkness with the raw force of an unstoppable battering ram. Its bristled hide brushed Jonas's coat as it shot past him, the impact spinning him sideways and sending him tumbling into a pile of wet leaves that clung to his face and gloves, while the air fled his lungs in a single crushing burst. He scrambled upright, heart racing, the forest spinning around him as the massive animal skidded to a chaotic halt several meters away, kicking up soil in a frantic spray. The boar spun sharply, snorting clouds of steam into the cold air, its eyes fixed on him with a mixture of confusion and rising agitation. It circled once, tearing deep grooves into the softened ground, and Jonas understood immediately that the animal felt cornered by the tight tunnel and now sought to regain control of the space around it. He grabbed his rifle, but the fall had driven mud deeply into the action, jamming the mechanism and rendering it useless in that frantic moment. His pulse surged with cold dread as he searched the terrain for anything that could provide a few seconds of elevation or cover. A fallen log lay across the forest floor, thick and half-decayed but raised slightly above the ground where its branches had once propped it up, and Jonas lunged toward it with desperate speed. He climbed onto the trunk, his boots slipping on the wet bark as he tried to steady himself, and the boar charged again with startling speed, driven by territorial instinct and the chaotic energy of being flushed from its underground shelter. The impact shook the log violently, sending splinters flying as the boar rammed its massive body against the wood with a force that rippled through Jonas's legs and threatened to unseat him. He gripped the trunk tightly, struggling to maintain balance as the boar struck again. The second hit even harder than the first, and the bark splintered beneath him in long, cracking lines that exposed the pale wood inside. Jonas felt his footing break for a moment, his boots sliding across the slick surface before he managed to pull himself higher. But the boar circled again, preparing for a third assault that would almost certainly tear the weakened log apart. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the animal lowered its head, its powerful neck muscles tensing in preparation for another devastating strike. Just as the boar lunged forward, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, catching a sheet of rusted metal half buried near the tunnel entrance. The wind lifted the sheet and rolled it noisily across the ground, scraping and clanging in a way that broke through the animal's narrow focus. The boar halted mid-charge, startled by the unexpected metallic sound that echoed unnaturally through the trees, and it snapped its head toward the movement with visible alarm. The shifting sheet clattered again as the wind pushed it farther, and the boar, overwhelmed by the sharp noise and confused by the sudden disturbance, bolted into the dense forest with heavy strides that faded rapidly into the thickets. Jonas remained atop the log for several long seconds, his muscles trembling from adrenaline and cold, and he slowly lowered himself to the ground only when the silence returned and the forest regained its natural rhythm. Mud clung to his hands, sweat chilled beneath his jacket, and the jammed rifle reminded him just how close he had come to being crushed beneath the full weight of a charging animal that had used an old wartime ruin as its underground refuge. He stood still in the fading light, staring at the tunnel entrance now partially blocked by the restless sheet of metal, and he felt a deep, lingering respect for the raw power that lived within these woods, a power that turned forgotten relics of the past into dangerous sanctuaries for the wild creatures that move through them with instinctive authority. On September 10, 2023, when the first hints of fall color touched the higher ridges of central Vermont, and the morning air carried that sharp, cool edge that bow hunters knew well, Dylan Mercer moved slowly across a maple-covered slope that he had scouted for weeks, believing a heavy-bodied white-tailed doe was using the drainage as a travel corridor between a stand of red maples and a low, wet meadow where the grass remained lush even during dry spells. He felt calm pride in the patience and care he brought into every hunt because he respected the land and the animals that lived on it. He carried his traditional recurve bow across his chest, and although he loved the challenge and simplicity of that weapon, he understood that it demanded perfect control of movement, because any sudden step or misplaced shift of weight could ruin his chance or even put him in danger in forests where black bears, moose, and coyotes roamed year-round. The slope beneath him was layered with damp leaves that hid small stones, rotting branches, and channels carved by summer storms, and Dylan kept his steps as slow and quiet as he could while he followed faint signs of fresh tracks that he believed belonged to the doe he had watched the previous week. The forest felt strangely still that morning, with wind barely touching the treetops and the distant hum of insects muffled under the heavy canopy, and while he moved through that quiet space, he failed to notice that a large black bear was feeding in the same drainage about 40 yards below him, pulling apart a fallen log in search of grubs and beetles, focused entirely on the food source and unaware of the hunter above. Dylan shifted his weight to examine a fresh hoofprint pressed into the soil, and when he placed his next step, the heel of his boot landed on a dry branch buried beneath the maple leaves, snapping it cleanly in half with a sharp crack that echoed down the ravine like a gunshot carried by still air. The black bear below lifted its head instantly, surprised at the sudden noise so close by, and because bears reacted to abrupt, unfamiliar sounds with instinctive defensive energy, especially in thick cover with limited visibility, it wheeled its massive body uphill and charged toward the source of the noise before it had time to process what it was running toward. Dylan heard the thundering movement only a moment after the branch broke, and he felt the cold pulse of instinctive fear spread through his chest as he realized the sound was not a deer bounding away, but something much heavier driving straight toward him through the undergrowth. He tried to sidestep to draw his bow in one smooth motion, but the wet slope betrayed him when his boot slid on a film of slick leaves, sending him tumbling sideways into a small sapling that bent with the impact and knocked the breath from his lungs. He scrambled to push himself upright as the bear reached him, the animal's dark shape moving with terrifying power and speed up the incline. The bear struck him in the shoulder and ribs as it barreled past in a burst of confused aggression, the blow knocking Dylan flat into the soft earth, and he felt a sharp sting in his chest as something cracked under the impact while the world tilted unevenly around him. He tried to shield his face and neck with his arms, but the bear's momentum carried it slightly uphill before it turned sharply, standing only a few yards away with its chest heaving and its breath rising in visible puffs in the cool air, trying to understand what had startled it so badly. Dylan's vision wavered as he tried to breathe through the pain in his ribs, and dirt stuck to the blood on his right shoulder where the bear's claws had grazed him during the collision, leaving shallow but painful cuts that throbbed with each heartbeat. For several long seconds, he expected the bear to rush him again because he knew black bears sometimes made brief follow-up charges if they remained uncertain or frightened. But he also knew that most serious black bear injuries occurred during sudden, close-range encounters where the animal reacted instinctively rather than with deliberate aggression. The bear lowered its head, sniffed the air, and finally recognized that the shape in front of it was a human, not another bear or a threat competing for food. With a deep huff, it turned and moved across the slope in a heavy bounding motion, snapping branches as it descended into dense cover where the morning shadows swallowed its dark fur until it vanished entirely. Dylan remained on the ground for almost a full minute before he managed to crawl behind a nearby boulder, where he leaned his back against the cold stone to steady himself and take short, careful breaths that sent small waves of pain along his ribs. He checked his injuries with shaking hands and found no deep gashes, only bruises and bleeding scratches, but his shoulder throbbed in a way that told him he might be out of the season for weeks. He reached for the radio clipped to his chest harness, struggling to raise it with his injured arm, and managed to send a brief call for help that sounded thin and strained even to his own ears. Rescue crews found him an hour later, pale, exhausted, and barely able to stand, but alive and deeply aware that the experience had shown him how even the most peaceful morning in familiar woods could change without warning when two creatures surprised each other at close range. As they helped him down the slope and toward the trailhead, Dylan knew he would return to the forest once he healed, carrying the same respect for the land, but with an even stronger understanding that calm, careful preparation could never fully remove the risks of hunting in wild country where animals reacted not with malice but with raw instinct shaped by survival. On August 14, 2025, the late summer heat shimmered over the rolling South Dakota prairie, dry dust rising from every hoofprint as hunter Riley Conover moved across open ground searching for pronghorn that drifted along low ridges at dawn. He carried a lightweight .270 Winchester across his back and used his binoculars to scan for the pale shapes of antelope grazing near sparse sage patches, aware that even the slightest movement or misstep could send them scattering across the endless horizon. The wind was warm but steady, carrying scents across the grass, and Riley felt the familiar focus that came with hunting wide, empty plains, where patience, strong legs, and careful observation determined success. The prairie stretched in every direction, interrupted only by small stands of cottonwoods marking shallow stream beds that had long dried. Riley stepped carefully, boots brushing over uneven grass, watching for subtle signs of movement. Suddenly, a cloud of dust rose on the western horizon, coalescing into shapes that moved with unmistakable force. His chest tightened as he focused the binoculars and saw a small herd of bison racing in tight formation across the basin, heading directly toward him. The herd's energy was wild and unstoppable, the kind that came from fear, confusion, or instinct. He dropped the binoculars and turned toward a cluster of cottonwoods that could provide cover, sprinting across the dry prairie as fast as the uneven ground allowed. The soil beneath his feet felt firm until it shifted unexpectedly under his right foot, collapsing suddenly. Riley plunged waist-deep into a shallow sinkhole, the edges crumbling as he tried to brace himself, and the shock of being trapped sent a rush of adrenaline through him while the pounding of the bison hooves grew louder with terrifying proximity. Riley twisted to lift himself free, but the shallow depression held him fast, pinning one leg beneath a shelf of loose soil. The lead bull reached the top of the rise just as Riley struggled to maintain balance. It skidded violently at the sudden drop, dirt spraying across his face, its massive hooves thudding dangerously close as it snorted and tried to regain footing. The rest of the herd closed behind it, confused by the uneven ground and forced to circle near the edge of the sinkhole, some animals only inches from Riley's head. He reached for his rifle, which had fallen just out of reach, and stretched his fingers in vain, feeling panic flare as the massive animals continued their chaotic milling. For nearly a minute, Riley pressed his hands against the soil, bracing against the sinkhole walls as the herd shifted and snorted around him, the vibrations of their weight shaking the ground. He lowered his head instinctively each time a hoof landed near the rim, knowing a single misstep could crush him. His chest heaved and his ribs burned as he struggled to stay calm, understanding fully that he could not rely on instinct alone in this moment. He needed a chance, some interruption to break the herd's attention before it became deadly. Then a distant coyote howl cut sharply across the prairie, long and piercing. The sound startled the herd enough to break their circle. The lead bull turned sharply toward the noise and the others followed, wheeling away from the sinkhole in a sudden coordinated movement. Their heavy bodies kicked up clouds of dust that drifted across the basin as they thundered down the slope, leaving deep hoofprints and torn grass behind them, disappearing into the wide-open prairie. Riley remained in the hole for several moments after the herd vanished, letting his heartbeat slow while testing his trapped leg. The ground was still unstable, but with the immediate danger gone, he managed to roll onto the grass, lying flat and shaking, covered in dust and sweat, muscles trembling from fear and exertion. He pulled himself fully from the sinkhole, grabbed his rifle, and sat on the edge of the depression, his body slick with prairie dust, his mind still racing. The escape had been narrow, almost impossible, and Riley realized how close he had come to being trampled under thousands of pounds of furious, panicked animals. The unstable terrain that had trapped him also saved him, forcing the bison to slow and circle rather than charge directly. He drew long breaths, feeling relief surge through him while scanning the distant horizon, knowing that the herd had disappeared, but that the prairie remained full of potential danger. Riley finally stood, brushing dust from his clothes and checking his gear, aware that the morning's near catastrophe would remain imprinted in his mind long after the prairie returned to its quiet rhythm. He had survived only because of quick instincts, luck, and the quirks of the land itself, a reminder that even the wide open plains could conceal sudden, lethal threats where the weight of nature's power met the vulnerability of a single human. He began moving toward higher ground and the nearest stand of cottonwoods, his muscles still tense, every nerve alert, understanding that hunting was always as much about respect and awareness as it was about skill or weaponry. The sun rose higher, warming the prairie, but Riley's thoughts remained with the sinkhole, the startled herd, and the seconds when survival depended entirely on the unpredictable interaction between man, beast, and earth. That day on the South Dakota plains would serve as a stark lesson. The wild, in its immense scale and raw energy, could turn a routine hunt into a fight for life in moments, and even the fastest reflexes were sometimes aided most by the quirks of the land itself.